go swiftly to Lydia Khalil, who will be presenting on anti-government extremism in Australia, understanding the Australian freedom movement as a complex anti-government social movement. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie. Just while Mel's bringing up the slides, I might as well just get started on that just for the sake of time. So I'm going to be presenting another case study example of another boundary riding movement, the Australian freedom movement. This so-called freedom movement is a diverse anti-government movement that emerged out of the lockdowns and other public health responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sure you have many memories of them. They've received quite a lot of coverage in the mainstream press. But they've since evolved into a broader and in many ways much more complex and diffuse movement that's still active, and it continues to undermine government legitimacy in various ways. So it's a boundary riding movement that I think is very difficult to define because it engages in multiple forms of action, some nonviolent, some violent, some within the bounds of what's acceptable in a democratic society, but one which we still have to put under the broad, imperfect label of an anti-government movement because it seeks to undermine the current democratic government because of grievances and narratives it holds about government power. And I think this movement serves as a really important case study to the themes that we're examining in this conference, which is, how do we deal with dissenting social movements in democratic societies that advocate for violence and engage in intentional violent protest foremost, and whose actions undermine social cohesion and core democratic principles and processes. So I think this movement really challenges us to think about where we should draw the line between legitimate democratic dissent, and on the one hand, and extremism on the other. So this presentation draws on data and analysis from a recent research publication, which I did along with Josh. It's published in the academic journal Perspectives on Terrorism. It's open source, accessible if you want to get it. It's not, you don't need to have a academic library credential to get it. And so in this study, we examined a couple of things. We examined the emergence and the consolidation of this movement, and we grappled really with how to define and understand it. And to do so, we drew upon, as Josh referenced, interrelated strands of social movement theory and the broader body of research on the role of conspiracy theories to offer us a conceptual framework for how we can understand this movement's emergence, consolidation, and development. We conducted a qualitative longitudinal analysis of data from the online posts of a prominent branch of the freedom movement, where we identified the movement's core narratives, their motivations, and their forms of action. And this analysis, again, helped us to understand how the movement developed and how it's actually not strictly an anti-government movement. It's actually a bit more complicated than that. It is anti-government, but it's also anti-institutional and it's anti-elite as well. And so while those three things are related, I think it's important that we ensure that we understand that they're distinct. So a bit of a background in the context of the movement's emergence and development. This is something, again, many of us all lived through and that you'd be familiar with. It emerged out of the COVID-19 pandemic and the ensuing lockdowns, the Fortress Australia paradigm that we lived under. Because very soon after the first recorded case in Australia, the Australian government made a biosecurity emergency determination under the Commonwealth Biosecurity Act, which meant that this gave expansive powers to the health minister. And so basically the health minister could issue any direction to any person, determine any requirements, issue criminal charges, fines, jail time, all of that stuff. And this was pretty consistent with Australia's history of having very strong biosecurity responses. This determination was in place for 25 months. And so during that time, the federal government and the state governments made significant incursions on our liberties and freedoms that we were kind of taking for granted living in a democratic society or a free society in the name of public health. Now, Australia clearly was not alone in this. Many, many countries around the world enacted similar measures. But Australia's pandemic responses amounted to some of the most strict public health responses in the democratic world, and also the longest cumulatively as well. Victoria and New South Wales made frequent use of lockdowns and other things. And I should note that these measures were broadly supported by the general public. However, and they definitely did reduce the spread of the virus and help reduce the risk of illness and death. However, they also did have negative consequences and effects. They added to the prolonged stress during the pandemic. The lack of social contact and support resulted in multiple psychological and social ill effects that have now been well documented. And additionally, a lot of these impacts, studies have shown, were felt unevenly across socioeconomic demographics. And even during times when these things were broadly supported by the general population, there was still a concurrent vocal opposition among a diverse cross-sector of society to them. And we also can't forget that the COVID-19 pandemic was accompanied by an infodemic of misinformation and disinformation and pandemic-related conspiracy theories, which is not uncommon during times of crisis where we see this rise in conspiracy theory belief. And so I bring this all up not to rehash the government's responses to the pandemic. We've got an upcoming inquiry for that. Or to re-traumatize us kind of living under the memories of all this, but it's an important context for the emergence of the freedom movement. So, and it's to say that the freedom movement would not have been able to develop and consolidate without these conditions. It may seem that the Australian freedom movement kind of arose spontaneously out of these conditions or as a response to it, but rather I would say that we should think of it as more of an opportunity, right? So the pandemic and the lockdown and the restrictions were an opportunity for anti-government and anti-democratic forces that already existed within society to exploit these conditions to further already held ideological and conspiratorial beliefs. So how do we understand it? We often had the media and many politicians, labeling the Melbourne Freedom Rally or the Freedom Movement as extreme far right. Many of them call them Nazis. And it is true, actually, that the anti-lockdown movement had significant overlap with Australian far right extremists and influencers and movements. The online administrator of the Telegram group for that channel, Harrison McLean, who's just shown here on the slide, was associated with far-right figures. That was established through investigative reporting. And here's a quote about how he used the anti-lockdown movement as a means to introduce these ideological views. However, because this movement involved a diverse array of actors with various motivations and beliefs, it can't be reduced to an exclusively extreme right or just blatantly label it neo-Nazi movement. So what is it exactly? How should we define it? How should we understand it? Well, it's a movement that incorporated a wide array of actors, including anti-vaxxers, religious communities, wellness influencers, QAnon believers, other conspiracists, sovereign citizens, all of those kind of amalgamated alongside actually with your so-called average citizens who just oppose the vaccine mandates or who just oppose the lockdown measures, but didn't really have any pre-existing ideological beliefs, extreme or otherwise, that would have them involved in this movement. But nevertheless, this divergent cluster of actors formed into a cohesive movement, and there were two things that broadly united them. One was shared grievances against government and mainstream institutions. And the second was belief in conspiracy theories about government and institutions, and particularly New World Order conspiracy theories. Even if they didn't label them that or didn't know that that's what they were, that was the background of the conspiracy theories that they believed in. So this demonstrated that there was at least a base level of cohesion that made it possible to refer to this as a cohesive social movement. And so given this diversity, we found that the CVE radicalization literature was kind of insufficient to help us understand and define this movement. So we sought to apply social movement theory to help us understand its emergence. Social movements, as defined by Professor De La Porta, who we just heard from, are informal networks based on shared beliefs and solidarity, which mobilize about conflictual issues through the frequent use of various forms of protest. And I'd say that's a pretty accurate descriptor of the anti-lockdown movement. And so consequently in our study, we selected key aspects of social movement theory as a frame to kind of guide our research into it and inform the coding of the data collected that we use to understand it. Another important thing about this community to understand is that its hybridity and its encompassment in a broader global movement. So it first began as an online social movement, started on Facebook. It first emerged there, and it wasn't the only online account that was active, but it was there. It became kind of the most predominant, and it was online that they could communicate, share grievances, organize protest action. But during the kind of the crackdown against misinformation and disinformation, they were soon deplatformed from the mainstream platforms and moved on to Telegram. And that became the movement's primary platform where it developed. It actually ended up playing a very critical role, Telegram, the platform, to its development and consolidation, because there were affordances and features within the Telegram platform that contributed to the movement's sustainability, to its growth, and to its mobilization efforts during a time when the pandemic restrictions actually made mass mobilization very, very difficult. However, it was not just limited to an online forms of action and expression. They used the online space to organize offline protests and offline action and rallies. And so you didn't have just keyboard warriors. You actually had people who were active online, active in the streets, and then would kind of translate their activity into the streets back to the online. So there was a lot of filming of what they were doing, bringing it back online. So there was this constant back and forth between the online and offline. And its hybridity also showed how it was able to be embedded and develop alongside the global movement, because the Australian freedom movement was not the only one. You had anti-lockdown freedom movements around the world. There was a worldwide freedom rally, the convoy protests, all of those things, which were very similar. Just a little bit about the methodology. So we collected and analyzed posts from sample periods of the inception of the Melbourne Freedom Rally Telegram channel from September 2020 to November 2021. And that period covered a 13-month period that coincided with the movement's development. We analyzed 3,648 original posts stored on in vivo for analysis. And we took sample periods, analyzed sample periods of that time. Because it was a public channel, we didn't need any permissions or requirements to access this. So it was a passive collection of posting data. We didn't attempt to access or incorporate private messages from that data that might have emerged. So that was one limitation to the methodology. The other limitation, as I said, is that it wasn't fully comprehensive. We didn't analyze every single post from that, just samples. And so clearly maybe different samples would have potentially given us different results. And also there's, limitations to qualitative data analysis, because the person who's coding and analyzing it might have different perspectives of how to interpret it. But given all these limitations, there was a consistency to the core themes that emerged that did allow us to kind of draw some conclusions, or we felt confident about drawing some conclusions about this. So in examining narratives, we used the following coding table. And we found that there were several common and core themes of the narratives that emerged from this movement. Not only was there a disagreement with government policy, pandemic policy, and a desire to protest it, as the movement said, but actually there was more of a distrust of government motivations and intentions, and a framing of government as tyrannical and illegitimate. So it was not just, oh, I'm opposed to this particular policy. It's actually the government is tyrannical and illegitimate. The movement also labeled itself publicly as one that was concerned about human rights and civil liberties, but actually we found that the posts around human rights narratives were the least prevalent. So even though there were posts around that, they were often cross-coded with anti-government narratives. So they'll start talking about the intrinsic value of human rights and then quickly devolve into, oh, there's Nuremberg trials that we should hold and government officials should be imprisoned and put to death. We also saw that conspiracy theories, unsurprisingly, played a central role in the narratives. And again, there was that combination and conflation of anti-government, anti-elite, and anti-institutional narratives as well. And it was the conspiracy theories that connected them all, because what do conspiracy theories do? They form connections between various powerful institutions, not just government, right? So it's about making connections between who is in government and who is outside government, who's holding the political power, how government is unable to control or is being controlled by an unaccountable, powerful global cabal. We also used the data to help us identify motivating factors. The conspiracy theories were feature in the narratives, but they were also an important, so they weren't just a framing device, they were actually an important motivating factor in mobilization, because the conspiracy theories played an important role in coalition building and mounting challenges to authorities as well. So on the individual level, we know that conspiracy belief or conspiracy theory belief can help make sense of an uncertain world. It kind of confers a specialness to the holder of this conspiracy theory as someone who holds special knowledge. But for the purpose of understanding social movement formation, conspiracy theories also play a role in in-group development of social identity, the identification of targets of social movement grievances. They can also create a comprehensive alternative worldview that the movement can collectively identify with, and it also helps in creating solidarity, all things important for the development of social movement. The prevalence of negative emotions also served as a motivating factor. So like Josh had mentioned before, similarly, anger, anxiety, alienation, those were the predominant negative emotions. And it wasn't just an individual one, but it was a shared experience of those types of emotions. And its hybridity and its online aspects help contribute to that shared experience of emotion. So you weren't in it alone, you were sharing it with everybody else. Also, deprivations and grievances were identified as one of the core motivating factors. This is just one example of deprivation and grievance that we saw, where employment was one that featured prominently as a kind of a deprivation, unemployment that was felt. And again, you see how that grievance was then combined with conspiracy theories. The interesting thing about the motivating factors was that ideological belief was actually not so prevalent in the data set. So there was less of ideological reasonings for being involved in this movement. I'll just run quickly through forms of action, and just to say that we found, again, there was this real grappling with whether we should identify this as a violent extremist movement, whether what they were doing should be considered as violent extremist action. Because what they were doing, if it wasn't under the guise of a lockdown and pandemic restrictions, would be lawful. So protest action is lawful in a democracy. But because it was illegal at the time, not only were they engaging in illegal action, they were actually doing forms of action that were provocative and were delegitimizing government. So we found it very difficult to utilize existing frameworks to differentiate. So we kind of came up with our own three. One is protest light, protest heavy, and violent extremism. And the data overwhelmingly showed that most of the forms of action was protest heavy. Protest heavy we define as participating in protests, violent protest action, protests targeting specific individuals in government, vandalism, confrontations with police, and things like that, which belied its claims that it was a peaceful movement. So in summary, because I don't have too much time, I think that while we might be very quick to kind of dismiss, or at least I am personally trying to move on beyond what was happening during the pandemic and move forward, I think this movement's really important because it helps further understanding of how conspiracies and disinformation can be utilized to feed into anti-government extremism during a time of crisis and emergency. It serves as an important case study for how diverse groups of people can come together who do not necessarily seem cohesive, but then can become so. It also shows it's an important case study of the hybridity of the social movements that are forming now. They're offline, online dimensions, which is now becoming increasingly common. And hopefully it offers a different typology of forms of action that move us beyond the binary of kind of violent extremism versus dissent or legitimate action. And it's also relevant because the freedom movement, while it's kind of cooled down from its pandemic days, it's still there. There's still a committed core people involved, and they moved on to other forms of activism, like the My Place movement that Josh has referenced, where so many of them have just moved into that movement. Anti-vax movement is still quite prevalent. And their activism can have sustained and complicated impacts on democratic governance because they both engage in anti-democratic and violent action and democratic forms of action like running for local elections and things like that. So they're quite complex, and thanks for your attention and look forward to questions and discussion.